Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 12th webinar of Nordway. Can you guys confirm in the chat that you can hear us? Yes, I can see hola todos from Arjo. Great. All right. So we're super happy to start again the webinars for Nordway in 2021. Today we will be speaking about product managers, product designers, their roles, who does what. So first thing first, let me introduce myself and our guest today. I'm Maïa. I co-founded Nordway, which is a program to launch your product manager career. Our fifth batch begins on the 31st of May. Before founding Nordway, I was the VP of product at Aircall, where I hired and managed about 15 PMs and designers, and I discovered product at BlaBlaCar. So today we're very happy to welcome Arjen as our guest speaker. Arjen is the director of product at Maïa, which is an extremely cool remote testing software. And before that, he was a senior PM at Typeform and N26, so pretty impressive background. Hi, Arjen. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, happy to be here.
We also have Jules, who was a product manager at Livy, co-founder of Nordway, who will be the moderator. Hello, Jules.
Hi, everyone.
I can see, guys, that we again need to upgrade the webinar plan because we have too many people attending. Perfect. We're on that. All right. So as usual, we'll try to keep it short, 35, 40 minutes max. We're going to have 25 or 30 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So you can ask your questions all along the webinar in the question section. Be careful, there's a chat and a question section. So ask your questions in the questions section. So today we'll cover a few topics. The first thing we'll cover super fast, because I know that most of you guys already know this, is the double diamond. And then we'll talk about the ownership of the PM and the product designer throughout a project using a real life example of Alan. And after that, we'll do a Zoom on Maze with Arjen. Then we'll have time for questions from you guys. One thing that I'd like to precise before we start is that all of what we'll cover today has to be taken with a grain of salt. Every company is different, has their processes, and adapts their methodologies to do it kind of their way. However, well, there are some best practices, and this is what we will share today. So to begin, just a quick recap of the double diamond, which many of you probably know already, which is actually a good recap of how things work for product managers and product designers. The idea is that in the process, you have two main phases. The first one is the problem phase, and the second one is the solution phase. It's shaped like a diamond because you're going to start by opening things up, going through, for example, data, user research, and then at some point, you're going to close off the diamond by prioritizing. And then you're going to do that again on solutions. So usually, talking about ownership, the product manager will be the owner of the problem phase, so the first one. What we'll do here is that, again, as I told you, we're going to use a real life example to illustrate these points, and we'll talk about Alan, which is the French mutuelle, and a real problem that Alan had in the roadmap about a year ago, which was how can we improve the conversion rate for small businesses who land on the homepage of Alan? So we had 6 people at Nordway who worked on that topic. I'll show some of their work. So thank you, Alan Turing, for agreeing to share your work. So the first step in the problem phase will be to define your success metrics. So this sounds super simple. But it's actually not that simple to come up with the right metric and the right goal. So this is really the product manager's responsibility, but they can work with data to come up with the right measure. So typically for the Alan problem, it will be to increase the conversion rate by X%, and you need obviously to be precise on the X%. But you could also look at, for example, reducing the percentage of sales touch points so that the process is completely self-service. So first, success metrics. The second step after that is that as a product manager, you'll start to explore data. So this is not a data analysis webinar. I won't go into details, but the main message is that this is the responsibility of the PM working with data. So just a few tips. The first thing is that you should always make hypotheses. You shouldn't just go ahead and say, I've got data, I'm going to spend the next 3 days trying to find insights without really knowing where you're going. This is the best way to waste your time. So the idea is to be data validated and not data driven. So you want to take a step back and make those hypotheses before you actually run the analysis. And the last thing I wanted to cover is that in my experience, a few insights from data is great already. Do not expect to get all the answers to your questions from data. So as an example, for the Alan topic, one thing you would typically explore is obviously the conversion funnel. So the percentage of drop at each of the different steps of the sign up on Alan. This is just one analysis, but you could and you should also look at, for example, the percentage of people who are on mobile versus web for the sign up. You could also look at, out of those who convert, is there a pattern in the path of the different pages that they see, etc. So again, really product manager here. In parallel or after data, you will work on user research. So again, here we made webinars on user research specifically. I will not go into detail, but the idea, you probably know it, is to speak to your users to understand the problems better. So you're going to do interviews, usability tests, etc. So for example, the people who worked on Alan made 7 interviews, 7 user tests. This is the responsibility mostly of the PM, unless there is a user researcher, but this is still quite rare, at least here in France. So the best practice is to invite the designer with you so that they can really understand the problem better at this point. So after these steps, you'll have a big list of problems that you came up with. For example, talking about Alan again, maybe you have the fact that 42% of users drop on this one page. Second problem, users don't understand the table of the tariffs for Alan. Third problem, the third step is actually not suited for companies with no employee, etc., etc. So you'll have a long list of problems and you want to prioritize them. And for that, obviously, you'll use prioritization frameworks. So for example, the RICE, the Moscow, the cost impact metrics, and you have many, many frameworks to prioritize. They all rely on the same principle, comparing the cost, the time you'll spend implementing it, and the impact on your metric. Prioritizing is the heart of the product manager's mission and role. All right, so now the problem is clear. We know why we want to solve it. We know what we want to solve exactly, and we'll start thinking about a solution. And this is where we open up the second part of the double diamond. So to go from problem to solution phase, there's usually a kickoff where the product manager recaps all the findings about the problem to the designer so that he or she can take over. And usually the product designer is the main owner of the solution phase. So the first step will be to frame solutions. So the goal is to come up with several potential solutions to fix the problem. And the best practice is that designer will own this. You have many methodologies. You can look at the Do-Code design sprints. You have many workshops on the Atlassian Team Plays website. And then the PM will usually come into play to prioritize. Again, a good resource for prioritizing is the following websites, prioritizationframeworks.com. So this step is also called, well, scoping the solution. So for example, to go back to Alan, this is a recap slide of the solution scoping that this group did. So they used the Moscow prioritization methods, and you can see what's in scope, what they're going to do in the solution, and what's not in scope, what they're not going to do. The step after that is to prototype your solution. And obviously, this is the product designer's responsibility. He or she will prototype, test it with real users, and iterate based on user feedback. So here you can see the example of an Alan prototype to fix the problem that we said before. Once the prototype is tested and validated, you will start the specs and the delivery phases. So this is not an exhaustive list of responsibilities, but if we were to really separate product manager and designers, basically the PM will define user stories, edge cases, tracking, rollout plan, and then we'll test functionally during the sprints. And then the product designer will ship the high fidelity prototypes, usually make them available in a collaboration tool for designers like Zeppelin. And then we'll also test the designs during the sprint and be available, for questions, iterations on design during the sprint. So before we zoom on Maze, again, I want to point out that this is not, the all truth that you will find in every company. Ownerships, methodologies, who does what, this really depends. This is one of my favorite sentences. It depends. All of this can vary. And so I guess as a product manager, there are 3 questions that you can ask yourself regarding these methodologies. The first one is basically, are there designers and how many? And obviously the ratio, PM to designers will impact your responsibilities if you are a product manager. Second is, what is the designer's expertise? And this is really one of the main learnings I had at Aircall, is that it's super important to be pragmatic and to adapt. I was managing several designers, and they all had, their skills, their preferences. And so basically a designer that is great and loves UI will not probably be involved the same way as a designer that's really more an expert at user research. And it's important as PMs to adapt also to that. And then the third question is basically, what's the type of project? The ownership of the designer obviously will not be exactly the same if you work on a project to revamp the UX of your product versus a super technical project like working on the API. So it depends. And as always, as a PM, you need to be pragmatic and to adapt. So that's it for the double diamond. And now I will leave the stage to Arjen to focus on Maze and talk about, your tips, your learnings about product design. And so the first question that we have for you is, well, the entire process that I kind of went through, how does that relate? How similar is that to what you actually have today at Maze?
Yeah, cool. Happy to speak about that. So it's actually very similar, and we didn't actually think of it as the double diamond, although it's popped up in the process documents where we've kind of outlined our process, I guess. But we noticed that we were already kind of doing this naturally. And so an example of this cycle, so we work with ShapeUp. So a bit of context about that. ShapeUp is a development framework similar to Scrum or Kanban. With ShapeUp, you have a set time to build. So it can be 6 weeks. And then you have a set time which is called the cool down, which is 2 weeks of where you focus more on technical quality and you take a breather, and then you kind of dive into the next project. And so there's always 2 layers. We have one layer that's the teams kind of building and delivering the solutions. And then another layer, which is like the PMs and some designers will be, and also some engineers will be shaping the next kind of initiatives. So how it works for us now, we've actually adapted ShapeUp a little bit, that we like to take a bit more time. So we put it into a full quarter. And so we have 9 weeks to build and 3 weeks of cooldown. This also gives us a little bit more time to really dive deep into doing user research, diving deep into the problems. So as an example, where we are now, we're kind of in the middle of a cycle. Right now, the PMs and some of the designers also are working on really diving deep into the problems that we're focusing on. Those problems are being dived into because, as you said, it all started with kind of a data point and somewhere we wanted to go. For our case, it's increasing our usage frequency from monthly active to bi-weekly active. Then we kind of dive deeper into like, hey, what are the problems? What are the friction points for people to do so? And then at the end of the cycle, when we go into this cool down phase, that's kind of where we go into more the concepting and testing, etc. And this even goes into the start of the build cycle, where engineers will start to spike and test and concept as well, until we finally kind of come to that last part of the diamond where we know what we want to build. This will be after week 2 or 3 in the cycle. And that's where we kind of go into execution mode, and we should have not as many unknowns at that point.
It's interesting you're mentioning you actually didn't call it the double diamond, because I remember discovering the double diamond actually quite late, and obviously a lot after, I had been pushing for all of those methodologies of like those 2 phases, who's the owner of what. And I just think it's, a super cool way to clarify it and talk about it, but in the end it's not rocket science, and it's just a way to make it super clear.
It's so natural as well, right? It's like, okay, let's look at the problems. What are the problems? Okay, let's scope it down. Okay, let's test, and let's, it's very like, yeah.
Definitely. So you mentioned right before we started the webinars that you actually have many designers at Maze, and a great ratio. Can you share with us, some tips to collaborate effectively with designers, mostly as product managers, I guess?
Definitely. So I think my first tip, and this is where you showed kind of the ownership, where the PM is more is owning the first part of the diamond, or the first diamond, I guess, and then the designer is more on the solution side. I actually believe that designer is maybe even more also on the problem side, and I think that would be my first tip, is really team up in research. I think as much as you can get design involved in that initial, really understanding the business metrics, understanding the problem space, speaking to users, knowing what they're saying, knowing the kind of the exact quotes and the exact pains and intonations, I guess, in how they say it is, I think, really important. So first tip, team up in research. Then I would say, I think treating everything in design as a hypothesis. So very much of like, I think it's very easy to get solution eyes and be kind of like, okay, this is probably good because I think it would be good and this would work for me. But it's so important to always treat everything as a hypothesis, right? Which is basically just a fancy word for guess. I think kind of having kind of clear, like, we believe that changing XYZ in this design will do Y, and even better, based on the fact that we see this behavior in the product, we believe that, so it's kind of based on a data point. Moving on from that, I think the last tip I would say is, it's so easy to speak different languages and to not be aligned on the scope, especially. So I think where I spend a lot of time between myself and design, but also engineering, is really, really aligning, right? And I would say align 3 times. Really, I love to use Miro for this as well, to kind of map out flows and do kind of, I think these are the moments where synchronous works very well. We're big promoters of async, but I think these are the moments where, having a synchronous workshop and saying, how do you understand this? What is the problem for you? What are we solving? Why is this solving the problem? I think just really nailing down on that is super important.
Interesting. And to go back to what you were saying about having those hypotheses super clear at all times, is that really something that you processize, if I can say, meaning that you have to write that down as kind of a user interview guide before you talk to your users? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we're still in the process of creating that. So ShapeUp was implemented just when I started, and ShapeUp it's not very prescriptive. Like it leaves a lot up to interpretation, and I think which it should, right? No development process is really the same. You can't just slap any development process onto any org. You need to adapt it, right? And according to how you work, who your customer is, what kind of cycles you have, you'll need to come up with ways of making it work for you. Similarly, we've been going through many iterations, and I think at the beginning we were just following it kind of by the book, writing a pitch and being like, okay, here you go, this is it, which didn't work out very well. And so slowly we're trying to put in more and more processes. And yeah, now actually, as you mentioned, we have a specific, so we have kind of a template in Notion that we follow now for each kind of shaping process. And having the hypothesis clear is a step now, but it's only since recently, after we learned that we kind of got burned by the fact that we didn't do that.
Okay, super interesting. So I guess this is one of the mistakes you made, and this was, the following question is, can you share with us in all of this product design process, what is maybe the biggest mistake that you made?
Definitely. I mean, I don't think I have to zoom into one particular. I think in general, as a PM, I like being on the solution side a lot. I'm a bit of a, I guess, dreamer, and I love products, and I love thinking of like what it could be. And I guess that's why now in my role, I'm quite happy because I get to think about the vision a lot. I think if you're kind of a PM on a team, it's also exciting to talk about solutions, right? Because that's what the customers will use, and that's maybe the new features and the interactions and everything. But I think this can really be a mistake. And I think also, I many times read like that wireframing is like a spec for a PM job, and I've always been quite of a strong believer that it shouldn't be at all. Maybe like flow mapping in Miro or whatever, but I try to not do anything of kind of design or solution. And I think that's come over time with kind of learning that it's so easy to bias a certain solution, just mentioning like, oh, we could do this, could already block certain other thoughts that maybe you didn't have, but somebody else would have had. But now that you kind of put a solution there, it's hard to unwind that solution, right? That's why also when you start with high fidelity, it's so difficult to then take a step back and say, okay, what are we doing here? What could the solution be? Is this even the part of the product that we should be solving the problem, or should it be an integration? It's like, so I think, yeah, biggest mistake is just being way too solution oriented. And I think now as a learning, really trying to take a step back from that always and really, really double down on the problem. Like I think at the beginning of my career, especially, it was just kind of like, okay, user problem, check. But then I think once you have the user problem, there's like a million other problems within that problem that you could be scoping down, like why do they have this problem? How often do they have this problem? Who has this problem? What size company is it? Do companies of like 10 people have this problem as well as enterprises? And so you can go so deep and really find a lot there as a PM. And I think the better you do your job there, the better the designer is going to be able to really solve for that.
That's super interesting. And yeah, I mean, I guess the mistake of going straight to a solution is really a typical one, but then going ahead and forcing yourself not to talk about any solution you'd have in mind is really, next level. And yeah, kind of really interesting. Does that also apply to the prioritization part? Once you prioritize on the solution part, is it how involved are the PMs at Maze in that part?
I think very.
Right.
I think that's a very collaborative process, right? I think and as you said, one of the frameworks for prioritizing was kind of the value effort side, and I think that's the PM's job is very much to bring the kind of the value side. So I guess you have a bunch of problems, then you scope it down to a certain problem or a certain part of a problem that you want to solve. Then certain solutions will come out in concepting. And then again, you kind of figure out which solution is that, right? And I think within that solution, then you have a bunch of scopes that are probably in or out of scope. And there, I think it's super important to have this really in-depth discussion between design, engineering, and product of like, hey, this is really important, but is it also really difficult to build? And how does this affect the usability? And like, so it's always a balancing, I think, but between the three, not even just between PM and product.
Yeah, right. And actually, this is also something we were wondering, for this webinar, we were focusing on the duo design and PM, but then it came as something supernatural to also talk about the engineers. We wanted to stick to the timing, but there is a Payfit, the French company, who talked a lot about the Triforce PM, product designer, engineer, and how all of those should be basically involved at every point. So yeah, that's interesting. And then, we just talked a little bit about user testing. Obviously, I guess you know a lot about that because that's what Maze does. Can you maybe share with us what you've learned about user testing and how has working at Maze changed your point of view about the whole process?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that the thing that I really learned is that it can really surprise you, and it can be very, very cost effective, right? My first role at Typeform was in product growth. And so there we were kind of trained to like as many experiments per month, per week. And so we had a team of just, basically I was creating hypotheses, again, fancy word for guesses. And then we would just run these tests, right? And at the beginning, we were not so fast. So we could maybe run one test per sprint per 2 weeks. But if you think about it, that's still 5-6 engineers working on one experiment that could fail, and it's really expensive. Now going back to Maze, so obviously since I started working at Maze, we have to be the biggest users of our product, right? If we don't believe in our own product, then kind of what's the point? So we always kind of try to push it as much as possible, see where its limits are. And because of that, we're finding like really cool discoveries that we probably would have missed and would have cost us a lot of money. Like a concrete example is, so we wanted people to adopt more use cases. And so we were going to change the way you create a project to basically have more use cases embedded. Right now, the process is quite simple. You just click new project and then that's it. And so we tested this flow, which was just riddled with hypotheses, right? Do people want it? I think it was born more from a company need rather than a user problem. And we tested it and people hated it. And so we got terrible usability scores. People really said like, well, you're complicating a flow for me that works right now. And I need to the feedback was really bad. And at first we thought, damn, that really sucks, like this, we really wanted it to succeed. But then like a couple of days later, we were like, oof, this is actually great news, right? This is really good because we learned that we shouldn't do this, or at least not in the current form. So we didn't end up investing in it. And at that moment, we kind of shifted focus again. We kind of spread out the team to work on other things that we knew were already validated and tested. And yeah, we might revisit this problem again at some point. But yeah, I think it's just biggest learning is it can be so surprising and so yeah, so quick to learn things, right? That's why we're really kind of trying to promote this rapid testing, where rapid testing and learning. So you're really kind of constantly learning way more than that you're just going out and spending 2 weeks to build something only to find out that it failed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I remember this so many times, having, designers or PMs in my team being so disappointed after the results of a user testing session, because all the guesses, as you say, the hypotheses were actually not validated, which is, you're right, good news. And it's great that you really insist on this, because I guess this is really something that every PM or designer goes through, and we should look at it, glass half full. It's really great news we found out so early. So exactly. So that's really nice. All right, great. Well, it's 12:30. We already have many questions from the audience. So as usual, just like 30 seconds on Noé before we jump to the questions. Bear with us. Basically, Noé is a 4 weeks intensive program to launch your PM career. So it's basically your first month as a PM. We have 5 sponsors from the top tech companies in the, the French ecosystem. and you'll work if you come at Nordway on real problems that they are facing actually in those companies. So if you want to learn more, you can visit Nordway.pm, where you will find a lot of information about the program. And I will actually let Jules go to the questions. If you have more questions coming, just drop them in the tab.
Yeah, many questions. The first question from Mathieu, who is part of your fan club, apparently, Arjen. What's the optimal ratio between product managers, product designers, user researcher, and developers?
Ooh, that's a big one. I think, well, first it depends. I guess that's the biggest context part. For us at Maze, we're figuring this out. We're quite early in our journey. I think as a very design-centric product, we try to keep the ratio very high in terms of high-end designers as opposed to low-end designers to engineers. So right now we have, on average, about a 1 to 2, 1 to 3 designer to engineer ratio. That means that we usually split up into teams of 2 engineers and 1 designer, and we have most teams covered. In terms of user researchers, so it's funny that Mathieu asked this question because he's actually joining us as a user researcher soon. So I guess he's curious to find out when we're giving him a helping hand. So in your case, Mathieu, it depends a lot in how good you're able to support us. I don't have a great answer to the user researcher side. In all honesty, like at Typeform, we got user researchers very late. At N26, we had a team of a couple, but we were 1,200 people there. So I think the ratio there was absolutely, incredibly small. I think, because, and it was a very deliberate hire at this stage to get a user researcher, because we want to make that a priority, right? It's not when we're like 1,000 people that we want somebody to come and help us with user research and empower the other teams to do better user research. So yeah, I would imagine that we keep the ratio high on user researchers as well. But that's let's see.
Okay, super interesting. We have several questions on documentation. So example from Matteo, who says, since the pandemic starting 1 year ago, I've been experimenting more and more with a synchronous way of working. So less meetings, more written stuff. Which concrete written artifact would you recommend using at each phase, and which role should own discretion? Basically, which document do you produce?
Maybe I can jump here on one thing that I found super helpful at Aircall and that I really love is actually something that I stole from Intercom in the way they worked, is to have one document at the end of the problem phase, which is a recap of basically everything you learned. So what's the problem? Why do we want to solve it? For who? And here you want to have also data backing, who are these users, what they represent, etc. And here, actually, what I found interesting is not this process, but just the fact that they said it should be no more than 1 page. And this is really something that you should commit to. And you can't write in, 8 typo font to make it smaller. The idea is really to have something that's super digest and super easily readable by the entire company, and specifically, obviously, people working on the solution parts. So I think this is the one thing that I found super helpful, is one doc, no more than 1 page, with the recap of what's the problem, for who, why do we want to solve it, and actually what they had was also ideas of solutions. So this goes against the philosophy of Arjen, but yeah, we called it the product doc. What do you think, Arjen?
Yeah, especially now, and I think also like at Maze we're fully remote and fully distributed, so we try to make async the default and only use sync sessions when really needed. because if we use sync sessions as a default, we're kind of excluding certain time zones. So it makes it very difficult. So I think, yeah, with documentation, you'll have to experiment. I think we go quite far with, so for every build cycle, I have this template in Notion that basically lists out all of the documents that we want to have. So this will be kind of a questions and answers document on for the team to write all their questions about the problem and the solution and everything that we're thinking around that particular idea. We have obviously the pitch, we have the research docs. I mean, it couldn't go very far, and it's probably too much to mention. I think the key here is really finding out what's most crucial for everybody and keeping it as short as you can, and then linking to other places. So one of the things that we're doing now is we're building up a big kind of research library. And the truth is nobody's going to look through that library, right? Especially not like it's super overwhelming and it's just a bunch of raw data. So what we're trying to do now is per theme, we'll put a one-pager of like, hey, this is what we learned about this problem. And then we'll link out to different user interviews or maze tests that we did. And this makes it the barrier very low for people to kind of come in and be like, oh, actually, I'll just learn about this problem. This is only one page of info. And I have all the high-level insights. And I think that's what we try to kind of maintain with everything. I guess there's like a UX design to documents as well as to products, right? Or to documentation, I guess, in general.
Yes, absolutely. And another question, you talked about rapid testing. Who do you rapid test with? Heavy users, any users, and about which sample size?
Yeah, so right now the process that we use is we'll go into Amplitude, and based on who we're trying to learn from, right? So I think the who you test with is so important, right? So if you're trying to test a certain problem, if you're testing that with people who don't have that problem, then you're going to get very bad results. So if we're designing something for the, I don't know, let's say user researcher persona, and for maybe a power user, so maybe a more specific feature in a paid plan, then it's obviously very important to speak to those kind of people. So what we'll do is we'll go to Amplitude, we'll create a cohort in Amplitude that kind of matches that criteria. So we'll put like, does XYZ, has a XYZ behavior, maybe uses XYZ feature, and then we'll export that CSV, and that'll be kind of the list that we test with. We usually have a conversion rate from email to like submitted test of around 10%. So I guess usually we try to test with around 20 to 30 people. So we'll end up sending it to 200 or 300 people.
Wow, 20 to 30 people testing is huge numbers. I guess that's thanks to Maze, right? Before Maze, did you manage to have those numbers?
Oh, not like, I think before Maze, it was just like for some reason, the number 5 is always floating around, right? Like 5 interviews and you're done. But that's also super tricky, right? Because so many times I've done 5 interviews and you just have like 5 people saying different things. It's like, what do I do with this? So it's great. I guess the nice thing about Maze is that you have quant and qual in there as well. You get like what people are interested in or kind of get the statistic, but then people can also explain why, and it's super useful. So we always try, the more the better. Some tests we even have 70 respondents or
wow.
Yeah.
Nice. And yeah, well, I totally agree that defining who are the right people to test is really part of the process and a step that you shouldn't overlook.
And coming back to what you were mentioning, Maïa, about the product designer being the owner of the solution phase, does it mean you make designers own the solution on their own? And how do you handle this in a very committed squad with PMs, QA, developers?
Yeah, well, to me, it's really a lot about duo and actually trio. So PM, designer, and engineer, and lead developer. When I'm talking about responsibility, ownership, in my experience, managing PMs and designers, it has always been super important to make sure that it's clear who is the owner of what. And that doesn't mean he or she will do it on their own. It's just at the end of the day, whose job is it to make sure that it's actually done. But then they're not doing it on their own, actually, never. The designer, typically, they're the owner of the solution part, but they will always do it for many people. Obviously, talking a lot to the PM, but what we did at Aircall was actually involving the entire team, so developers as well, the business stakeholders, and, well, of course, the users, number one, but that goes without saying. So, yeah, really, ownership doesn't mean doing it alone. And concretely, how does it work? Well, we were, big fans of workshops, so it was pre-COVID. So as Arjen mentioned, on that part of thinking about solutions, I'm also going for synchronous meetings, just because nothing beats having, 4 people thinking about the same problem at the same time. What do you think, Arjen?
Yeah, so I agree. I was thinking exactly the same, like that ownership doesn't mean it's that person's sole responsibility, right? So we actually, we ran into problems with this at Maze, and we decided to implement this. It sounds very corporate, but it works. It's the RACI framework, where you have responsible, so it's usually the team responsible for doing the work. Then you have accountable, the person who is just the person that people look at when either there's a decision to be made that's like 50-50 on either side, then that person is accountable, but also accountable for maybe giving updates or being the person of contact there. And then you have consultant and informed, which are usually more the consulted could be maybe the CTO, and informed could be maybe someone in support. So I think that usually clarifies a lot for us, what it means and who's involved in the project. And usually it's everyone kind of chiming in, but the accountable person, as it says, is really accountable for the projects. Yeah. And
yeah, you're right. These kinds of frameworks, we also use the RACI, scares people somehow. As soon as you start to have tables with who's responsible of what, it's like, what the fuck are we? Can't I just, be involved where I want to be involved? So I think these are great tools, and they can really help on the productivity of the team. It's important, to clarify that this is not about like looking over anyone's shoulder, but having these clear responsibilities. To me, makes a big difference. And if you're a manager, I guess you should be careful about the way you announce it and pitch the problem and why we're doing it, basically.
Yeah, it just gives clarity, which is super nice.
Okay, I think we run out of time, so maybe one last question. We're going to answer all your questions by mail after that. So question from Patricia, in small teams, would you recommend to hire a product manager or product designer? The person will be working on defining the problem, user interviews, wireframing, specs.
The question is who should be the first hire, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, very, very hard to answer. Well, what I've seen mostly from many startups that I speak to is that the PM comes first, and then usually there's a kind of someone who is doing the design work on top of other things, like typically a company designer who would do both, like, the website branding and then also the designs for the product. And then, of course, at some point, this doesn't work anymore, and you need to hire also a product designer. What I've seen mostly is that, the product manager comes kind of first, and then usually they also kind of do their own wireframing, which is not ideal because this is not their main expertise. But I guess it could work the other way around. I guess there's no rule. What do you think, Arjen?
Yeah, I'd say if you start small, it also depends on like how many engineers is then enough, right? Like I would say, like if you need to make a choice, maybe start with less engineers as well. Start with two engineers. We work in teams of 2 engineers, 1 designer, and 1 PM, so that's 4 people. I think you're able to already do a lot with that group, but I think the skills, it's just difficult. And I think this whole talk, right, around the double diamond process and how you really have these different phases, these different mindsets that you're in, it's very difficult for one person to hold that. And yeah, if you're a designer and you're also completely responsible for the problem and the business metrics and everything, it's just a lot. I'm not saying it can't be done. And maybe you have a PM that can do really good designs. I don't know, but I would try to always have like at least one discipline of each. Will, I think, be the best foundation to move forward.
Yeah, definitely agree. All right, well, super interesting. All of these answers, Arjen. Thank you so much. We'll stop here. It's already 12:45. Thank you so much for coming, being here today. It was really interesting. Thank you, everyone, also for being here. And we will have a replay available very soon that we will share on LinkedIn and on our website. Thanks again, Arjen.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.